say you're living good. Pretty lawns with fancy landscapes. She stares ahead with a blank gaze in her lovely neighborhood where the living is good.
And welcome back to Reverse Your Thinking. I'm your host, Marc Gertz. I am a mortgage broker, and my goal this afternoon is to reverse your thinking on many, many topics, to get you thinking outside the box, to turn your mind around and approach things from an entirely different point of view. In order to do that, you need to be open-minded and receptive to looking at things from a different point of view. And that's what we're going to try to do with you today. The opening music was from Angie Wells, whose latest album is soon to be released. You can find that song, Where the Living is Good, on Amazon and iTunes and all those other regular places. And Where the Living is Good is where we want to go, and what this show is designed to try to help you to achieve. And thanks for joining us on today, January 27th, which, believe it or not, is National Vietnam Peace Day, World Breast Pumping Day, Holocaust Remembrance Day, National Chocolate Cake Day, and National Big Wig Day. Now, I don't want to make light of Vietnam Peace Day. If any of you are Vietnam veterans or families with missing Vietnam vets, I take that very seriously, and I wish you all the best. But I really want to know about National Big Wig Day. I don't know. Is there a National Small Wig Day, and who wears big wigs anymore outside of going to a costume party for 17th century France? Anyway, we're going to cover a lot of things this afternoon. We have a great guest coming at mid-show, but I wanted to go over something with you that I thought was really, really interesting. And that is that a new study's been done, and it says that 67% of Americans are prioritizing present needs over retirement. Let me read that to you again. 67%, 2 out of 3 Americans are prioritizing present needs over retirement. I don't know if that's an outcome of COVID-19 or what, but most people right now are more concerned about paying their bills than saving for their financial future, according to a study from Alliance Life Insurance Company of North America. This is particularly disturbing because this means that in 20 or 30 or 40 years, you potentially are going to have another generation totally unprepared for retirement. By the same token, a majority of Americans, 55%, say they have either stopped or reduced their retirement savings due to rising inflation. And 45% say that they have to dip into their retirement savings because of rising inflation. That's also disturbing, the fact that people are dipping into their retirement plans and their IRAs and their 401ks just to make ends meet. Now, it breaks down once you start getting into the generations. 3 in 4 millennials, 75%, say they are more concerned about paying bills now than saving for their financial future, compared to 73% in Gen Xers and 56% in baby boomers. At the same time, 66% of millennials say that they've either stopped or reduced their retirement savings due to rising inflation. You know, at the same token, we keep hearing on nightly news about all the people that say they don't want to go back to work or they don't want to go back to the job. You know, folks, you can't have it both ways. You can't be worried about paying your bills and not going to work. So somewhere along the line, some type of compromise is going to have to be reached. Along the same lines, let's talk for a moment about reverse mortgages in the news, because, you know, a lot of people reaching retirement age now, 55 and up, look to reverse mortgages potentially as a way to create liquidity in their retirement and take some of the equity out of the house they live in or other types of real estate property without having to make payments. and at the same token, retaining title of ownership to the property and not having to move and being able to age in place. A recent article in Money Talk News notes that home equity can be useful and often overlooked retirement asset, and that a reverse mortgage is one option to access home equity and live a more comfortable retirement. So at the same token that people are pulling money out of retirement savings, more and more people are starting to look to home equity as a way to maintain the quality of their retirement. But what is retirement? When does that start? Well, we come back from our next message. We're going to talk about that some more. And we're back on Reverse Your Thinking. I'm your host, Marc Gertz, and you're listening to KMET Radio. For those of us in our audience that would like to maybe discuss some of these topics, you can reach us at 951-922-3532. Again, 951-922-3532. For those of you that are about to enter rush hour traffic on a Friday, we would rather you didn't call us. Keep both hands on the wheel and your eyes on the road and just sit back and listen. When we talk about retirement, we have certain assumptions about what that means, but those facts are different depending upon where you live in the world. Recently, there was a 1,000,000-man march. Now, let me say that again. There was a 1,000,000-man march in France over plans there to raise the retirement age. But here's the interesting thing, folks. They're talking about raising the retirement age from 62 to 64. Yeah, you heard me right. They want to raise the retirement age 2 years to age 64. That doesn't even compute in the United States, where most people don't retire before 65 or maybe even 70. How do you feel about that? Does that sound ridiculous? Well, when most retirement plans for baby boomers were put together, people's average life expectancy was maybe only into their 70s or maybe their early 80s. But now, living to 100 is a goal for most people. My father lived to be 97. Let's take a quick rundown, just for the fun of it, to see where this trend is going. If we look at the UK, the retirement age there is 64, 65, but in the Great Britain, they're saying they're going to raise it to age 68 by 2037. In Germany, retirement is 65, and they say they're going to raise it to 67 by 2029. France, well, I already told you about France. Italy, retirement is 67 or 66, and they're pretty much planning on keeping it there for the foreseeable future. Spain is 65, the Netherlands is 66, even Hong Kong is 65. But if you go to Austria, retirement's as low as 60. If you're a woman, 65 if you're a man. I'm not sure how I feel about that. Nothing against you ladies, but still in all. Ireland, the retirement age is 66, but they're talking about raising it to 68. What do you think about that? What should we do in the United States? People are living longer now. People are talking about wanting a more balanced life, especially after COVID. I know a lot of men in their 30s and 40s that got a chance to see their families grow up under COVID, and they're not so quick to go back to working 60, 70-hour work weeks if they don't have to, because they want to see their kids and they want to see their families. And by the same token, with retirement, many of us are concerned about if we're going to have an opportunity to enjoy those years. But again, we're living longer. Is 70 a reasonable retirement age? I don't know. What do you think? Or maybe it should be 72. Give us a call, 951-922-3526. Anyway, some tips I was recently reading about regarding strategies for planning for retirement when it's still 10 years away. Isn't that interesting? You have articles coming out about planning for retirement 10 years in the future at the same time that people are talking about the fact that they can't save for retirement. But for those of you that can, there are some really interesting suggestions about what to do when you still have 10 years to go before retirement. Let's go over them for a second. The first one is, and I like the first one, it says try out retirement destinations on vacation. That's an interesting concept. In other words, what they're saying is, what this article is saying is plan your vacationing around your retirement 10 years before you're supposed to retire. Start going to countries or start visiting states where you think you might want to spend your golden years. I know a lot of people are looking at Portugal right now as a possible destination. A lot of people look at Central America or New Mexico. That's a great suggestion. Try those things out within 10 years before you're going to retire. Another suggestion, and this I think in a lot of ways especially applies to men, build a social network outside of your office. A lot of people, their entire social network is totally about what they do at work. Well, what happens if you don't go to work anymore? All of a sudden, you got no friends and you got no place to socialize because they're still at work. Don't put off home repairs and renovations. Start volunteering now. That's a good thing to do at any age, is to get involved and do some volunteer work. Prepare now for rising healthcare costs. You got to set money aside for those things or make plans to take over your health insurance plan at work when those things start to happen, because when you leave work, you could be losing that health insurance too. There's also a great quiz at AARP that's suggested that you might want to take to see if you're mentally prepared for retirement. Not everybody is. A lot of people retire and they just don't know what to do with themselves. Another great thing, check in on your pension plan. Get savvy about what's going on. Find yourself a financial advisor and wait as long as possible to take Social Security. That's a topic we could cover just by itself. We'll be back in a few minutes with our guest today. Thanks for listening. And we're back. Welcome to Reverse Your Thinking. I'm your host, Marc Gertz, and it's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce you to our guest. Today's guest is the Honorable Glen Reiser. Judge Reiser has vast experience adjudicating and resolving thousands of complex commercial, real property, environmental, trust, and family law disputes as a respected trial judge and litigator. Judge Reiser spent more than 20 years on the Ventura County Superior Court, serving as both supervising probate judge and California Environmental Quality Act judge for more than a decade. Prior to his appointments to the bench, he litigated hundreds of civil cases to successful conclusion in trial and appellate courts throughout California. He teaches regularly at California Judge Trust, Probate, and Conservatorships through the Judicial Council. Too many J's, Judge. I got too many J's. Judicial Council of California Center for Judicial Education and Research. And he's known for his thoroughness, intellect, attention to detail, and breadth of knowledge to develop creative resolutions to disputes of all kinds. Please welcome the Honorable Glen Reiser.
Thank you, Mark.
Glad to have you, Judge. I really appreciate you coming on. I have no doubt that our audience is going to learn a lot from you. When you and I spoke previously, one of the big topics we were talking about was trusts. And if you don't mind, in the time that we have, I'd like to just jump in right there and have you talk with us for a few minutes about that. In your opinion, should everyone have a trust?
So the answer to that is no, not everyone should have a trust. It really depends on the extent of your estate, right? And that is a kind of a loaded term, because when we talk about people's estates, you have to put things in what I call bins. So if you have contractual assets, meaning if you have bank accounts where there's a paid on death beneficiary, or if you have an annuity where there's a designated beneficiary, or a life insurance policy where there's a beneficiary, or even a retirement plan where there's a beneficiary, those are not trust assets. Those aren't probate assets. Those are contractual assets. And unless you make a trust the beneficiary of any of those things, those assets all pass directly under the contract to whomever the beneficiary is. So when you think about your estate, normally you want to cull out all of that contractual stuff. And then you also want to cull out everything that I call survivorship asset, means something with a joint tenancy with the right of survivorship, because those pass by operation of law when somebody dies. So when you talk about your estate, typically you're talking about, from a trust and probate standpoint, everything other than those things. And so what's left over, if you want to create a trust, would be assets you put into a trust. And if there's anything else left in your life, cornucopia, that would be your probate estate. So if your gross estate, when you subtract out all the contractual stuff, is less than 184,500 in California, you don't even need to have a probate or a trust necessarily, unless you specifically want to manage somebody to manage your assets after you die, and you want to designate who's going to manage them and how they're going to manage them. Otherwise, if it's less than 184,500 gross estate, just let it go, because there are affidavits people can sign to pass property on. And if your gross estate is more than that, you have to decide really if you want to some degree micromanage how things are not necessarily distributed, because the probate court can do that, but how you want them managed. So it's a long answer to a
right.
question.
Well, let me ask you this, if I can just move it to the side.
Yeah.
I do business outside of the state of California. In addition, so like, for example, I have clients in Texas, and when I talk to financial planners or attorneys in Texas, they say, well, nobody does trusts in the state of Texas. Almost, well, I shouldn't say nobody, but the percentage of people that have them are much, much smaller than in California. Is there something about California law that makes it a good idea to have a trust?
The reason a lot of people want trust, Mark, is because it saves them the fees of going to probate. Because in other states, there's different rules in every state about how probate is managed. But in California, there's statutory requisite fees when you have a probate. So in California, your probate, the probate fees to both the attorney and to the personal representative, whether that's an executor or administrator, those are assessed by law at 2% of the first 100,000, 3% of the next 100,000, and then 8%, and 2% of everything between 200,000 and $1 million, and then 1% between $1 million and 10 million. So those fees can be avoided because you're not going to court in probate. And while the trustee can take fees, they don't have to take fees.
Right.
And there doesn't have to be a lawyer until there's a trust dispute, and then there are typically a lot of lawyers.
Okay, well, so in terms of the value of an estate, is that based upon the gross value of the assets or the net? So if somebody has $1 million house and they got a $500,000 mortgage, is that a $500,000 estate for trust purposes, or $1 million?
So for probate purposes, that's $1 million estate. For trust purposes, it is what it is. So it's $500,000 in equity and real property that you're going to distribute somehow or have managed.
Right. So in other words, anybody listening to us that owns a piece of real estate that's worth more than $185,000 right then and there probably needs to consider a trust.
I would think you would want to consider a trust, because they're very malleable. They're contracts, and you can basically decide how they're to be managed after you pass.
Yeah, most of my clients that I've talked to about trusts, when I've gotten referred to someone that wants to talk about a reverse mortgage, the big issue they have, I mean, nobody that I've spoken to has ever said, no, I don't want a trust. All right. What they've all said is, I don't want to pay for a trust. I don't want to, they said, you referred me to an attorney. They want $5,000 to put a trust together. Can't people just download it from the internet, the paperwork?
Well, the short answer is you certainly can download it from the internet, but there's also saying, Mark, that you get what you pay for, right? Because
yeah, it's true.
I'm not an estate planner, right? I was a litigator and then a judge, but I managed thousands of probates and hundreds, if not thousands to this point, of trust disputes. And so it really, you want to tailor your trust agreement to your financial situation, as well as how you intend to distribute the assets, and in what order, who's going to manage them, who's going to live in your house after you pass, if anyone. So you really want it specifically tailored to the individual, and estate planners are specialized and competent to do that. So I would not, while I'm sure that there are many things that lay people can do, trusts are extraordinarily complicated, and you don't want to step on your feet with something as important as your estate.
Okay. So what I'm hearing from you is that one of the main reasons, one of the biggest motivating factors to consider having a trust is so that your estate, your kids, your heirs don't incur delay and fees with regard to having your estate settled. Is that correct?
Right, because probates are judicially managed, even though the law requires them to be closed within a year if there's not a estate tax implication. Sometimes it languishes more than a year, and the courts are very involved. A revocable living trust doesn't have any court involvement at all until the kids or the beneficiaries or the heirs start fighting, in which case the courts get very intimately involved and people spend hundreds of thousands of dollars litigating.
Okay. So what it sounds to me like is that basically a family, and by a family I don't mean the couple that owns the house, but the extended family, they're going to pay for this one way or another.
Yes, at some level, right? Because you can always, die without a will or a trust, and your assets will pass through what we call intestate succession, and there's very defined rules about your issue or your next of kin and your spouse, and community property goes one way, separate property goes a different way. Right. But if you do that, if you don't do a will or trust, you have to assess the situation in advance and say, this is how I want it to go. And also recognize that's going to go through probate as well. There's just not going to be a will that's going to be administered.
Well, does a person still need a will if they have a trust?
Because you can only put things into trust that you designate, that you title in the trust. And so people acquire assets after they do a trust. There are quite often assets that you forget to put into a trust, and there are assets you may not want to put into a trust. So everybody who does a trust almost invariably does what we call a pour over will, that says basically, if I didn't put all my stuff in the trust, then a probate could theoretically open to pass those assets into the trust.
Okay, so you as a judge in this situation, basically, how do you get involved in trust situations?
So in court, right, I managed a probate court for way more than a decade. In court, every probate has to be judicially managed. So you open the probate, you make sure the inventory is filed, you make sure the creditors are noticed, and then there are a number of tasks that need to be accomplished by the personal representative, and then at the end, you close the probate and you order distribution. So that's how probate works. Trust, let's say you leave your house in trust and you appoint one of your children as the trustee. Well, that child decides that they want to stay in the house for a while, for a long while. and they don't want to pay rent. And the other kids are going to have a problem with that. And ultimately they'll go to a lawyer's office. And to coin a phrase, all hell's going to break loose. And a lawsuit's going to be filed alleging breach of trust. And they're going to go to town with your estate because they're going to litigate. When those cases litigate, they litigate out for years. I mean, I have cases, Mark, that are a dozen years old that are trust disputes. They just,
Wow.
once the trusts start litigating, absent resolution, because I do, I'm retired, so I mediate these cases, get them resolved. But if you just let them go, I mean, your whole estate can dissipate.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, that doesn't sound like a lot of fun.
It's fun for me, but
I'm sure you have some great stories about some of these things too.
Well, these are, of all the legal disciplines, as a neutral, I just now all I do is trust disputes. And the reason I do it is because it's really layered. The legal issues are very interesting. It's all equity based. It came from the Chancery Court in England and not from the law courts. And the family issues are always very complicated. Once the parents pass, the glue that holds the family together is lost. And quite often in every family, there's someone who didn't like the blue bicycle or pink bicycle 50 years ago. And
right.
In my case yesterday, Mark, one of the kids said, well, Mom gave me 3 sausages and my brother only 2 when we were kids because she liked me better. So the other brother was unhappy about it. And, $100,000 in fees later, they came to me.
I gotcha. Do you like mediating compared to when you were judging?
Oh yeah, that's why, I could still be in court, but do you remember the old Lucy show where there were all the chocolates on the conveyor belt, right?
Yeah.
And she can only put certain chocolates in the boxes. That's being a judge, because there's so many cases. You can take care of some of them, but there's just this deluge of litigational matters. And so and then after every decision, Mark, I'd write an opinion, because trust and probate cases are judge centric.
Right.
And I'd have a temporary friend and a permanent enemy, and my permanent enemy would spend a few $100s and go to the Court of Appeal. So these cases would last forever. And I was a cog in basically the judicial machinery. Now I've got a problem that people have been spending nights and weekends, they can't sleep. They're fighting with their relatives, maybe a mother against her children, children against their father, siblings feuding with each other, caregivers getting involved. And so I can, in one day, get the case over with and everybody resolved to the mutual dissatisfaction or satisfaction of everyone. And they're very, you can palpably see the anxiety come off their face. They're so stressed about litigation and expense, and you end it in just a few hours. And it really is very rewarding. So I love it.
It sounds in a way that you do in relation to trusts and estates what collaborative attorneys try to do in divorce.
It's quite often. That's exactly right. I mean, that's the same thing, right? I just never have, because my relatives typically could be violent towards one another at times, or certainly not civil. They never see each other. I keep them in separate rooms, and I work, sometimes I have 3, 4, 5, 6 rooms, depending on the size of the family, the number of beneficiaries, what's at stake. But I shuttle between rooms, and I get resolution that way because once I get people, have to keep people linear and in their subcortex, right? Because once they get reptilian and back into the amygdala, it's a very difficult day if they're venting all day.
Yeah, once people get their hair up, their backs up, it's kind of hard to bring them down.
Correct.
Yeah. How would somebody get in touch with you if they wanted to talk to you about mediating for them?
So typically, right, I work with JAMS, which is it's the largest neutral company in the world. There's, it's all over the US and California.
Mediation company, right?
Right, exactly. and it's mostly retired judges. It's basically a co-op of retired judges. So
Mhm.
depending on what your discipline is, if it's trusts, I'm probably the go-to person, or one of them, certainly. We have other trust specialists, but whatever the issue is, you would contact JAMS and you would say, here's my issue.
Do you know offhand what JAMS stands for?
Judicial and Mediation Services.
Oh, okay, great,
Yeah.
great. Okay. Well, when we get back, I want to talk to you about a few other things on behalf of our audience, not the least of which is how to go about finding the right attorney to handle this for them. Okay?
Fabulous.
We'll be back in a few minutes. And welcome back to KMET. I'm your host, Marc Gertz. This is Reverse Your Thinking. And we're talking to Judge Glen Reiser, who works now as a private mediator. And just before the break, I had asked Judge Reiser to explain to us what's the best way to find an attorney to put a trust together.
So you would not just want to guess on that, right? Because and it's very difficult because you don't pick up the yellow pages anymore and just let your fingers do the walking. It would be like finding a doctor, right? You would typically ask other doctors, who's your doctor, right? And so you may want to ask lawyers, who did your trust, if you're looking to do a trust, because then you're not. I'm not saying that you could ever get a pig in a poke, but you might have somebody who doesn't have the necessary or requisite experience to really have the creativity to make it as individual as it needs to be for your particular situation. So yeah, you would definitely want to ask people who actually know.
Okay, good. Let's drill down a little bit and maybe talk about some things that are particular to trusts. Like, for example, should somebody distribute assets equally to all of their children?
Well, certainly if you want to avoid litigation, that is a good tactic, because I would say that I would have very little trust mediation work if everything was equitably distributed by parents to each of their children proportionally. If you have 4 children, everybody gets a quarter. That's not going to cause a lot of conflict. But what happens is, people get older. Quite often, Mark, one child will stay to take care of the parent, or stay locally to take care of the parent health-wise and deal with all of those issues, doctor's appointments, schlepping them to the Vons, Ralphs, whatever. And while the others are just out living their lives. And then at some point, the parent will amend their trust and say, you know what, my daughter's been here for me for the last 5 or 6 years. I'm going to give her some additional share of my estate or asset or my house. And those kinds of unequal distributions are really a catalyst for litigation, because then there are allegations of undue influence, arguably lack of capacity, and it causes rifts among the children that can never be repaired, and they wind up in litigation quite often, probably most often.
Let's just talk about that a little bit further. If the parents talk to all the children about that before they do it, do you find that eliminates that problem?
It does to a large degree. That's a really good question. But trusts are supposed to be secretive, and parents, they don't want to offend their kids, and so many parents, because I only see the problem cases, obviously, but many parents don't want to cause that kind of a rift among their kids, and so they will keep their trust amendments private because they are private, and then when they pass, someone will show up with either the restatement on a trust or a trust amendment, and then that doesn't bode well for the future with respect to whether or not the kids accept that willingly, or they want to litigate because they're mad, and quite often they're not mad so much, Mark, about the disposition as they are about things that happen in their life. If they're a younger sibling, older sibling, and there's jealousies, if somebody got a pink bicycle at age 7, or a blue bicycle at 10, it plays itself out 50 or 60 years later on a different stage involving the trust. It's
Right.
It's the way siblings operate.
Do you think, based upon your experience and all the cases that you've seen, do you think that generally speaking, that parents would be better bringing their children into their trust decisions and their will decisions while they're still alive?
Yes, the answer is yes. So, for example, my mom, she's in assisted living. She's in her 90s, and she has all of her faculties. And she goes, Glenn, because most houses in Southern California, they have an older 2-story home down in Orange County. My sister lives there. And my mom said, I'm going to give the house to your sister. And I go, why? And my mom, and she goes, well, because she needs it more. And I go, okay. So we've had that conversation, right? So I'm not going to contest it. But if, my sister was living near my mom, and all of a sudden, my mom passes, and I find out that my sister gets every house is, a lot of houses are $1 million now in Orange County, right? $1 million house, even if it's 50, 60 years old. I would be I might be mortified, but I would be ticked off.
Yeah, you'd be ticked off. Sure. Yeah. I think most people would.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's how these cases get started. And we have those cases, and we also have, I'll call it the trustee who can't be trusted, right? Because when a child becomes the successor trustee, which is most frequent, they have 2 checkbooks, right? One they're supporting their family on, where they're paying for their costs of living. And you have this large checkbook, which has the parents' institutional accounts in it. And sometimes there's a temptation to use the bigger of the 2 checking accounts. And then thirdly, we have blended families where there's a step parent, and the way the trusts evolve when there are step kids and a new spouse, that causes conflict very often.
I see. Okay. Well, the second biggest question I always get from clients, the first is, how much do I need to pay? But the second biggest question always is, well, who should I make my trustee? And as someone in your shoes that's seen all of these things, what do you think is the answer to that?
So some parents try to make all the kids the co-trustees, right? And that's okay, as long as it's an odd number, not an even number, right? Because if you have 2 people in charge and they both have 1 vote, it has a tendency to cause an impasse. And when you pick one child, which is the most frequent, usually it's either the child that the parent has relied on in their latest years. I think you call them the golden years, or is the one that they think has the best mindset, best intellect for managing assets, right? And that in and of itself causes some problems, because it's about control, and the person who has control always has the upper hand. And in litigation, if someone is suing the trust, those fees always get paid, but the people challenging the trustee don't get their fees paid. So there are a lot of sub issues and nuances in this kind of work, and so we try to get everything resolved.
Well, we really appreciate you being here. Before we go, could you just tell our audience again how to get in touch with you?
So my staff, if you go to JAM's website, JAMS,
.com.
Yes, just put JAMS, and it will come up. There's offices, internationally, but I work out of the Los Angeles office, and I'm a California neutral. Southern California. Just if you do Glenn, that's my first name. My staff will respond. But if you are engaged in litigation involving trust, which I'm certain some of you are in the audience, Talk to your lawyers. Just make sure you get a good neutral who has chops and experience and the ability to get the parties to get to yes.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Glen Reiser, and we'll be right back. And we're back on Reverse Your Thinking. I'm your host, Marc Gertz. You're listening to us on KMET. For those listeners that want to call in, 951-922-3532. I want to talk in this last segment of the show about something a little bit different. And it kind of piggybacks a little bit on what Judge Reiser was talking about relationships between people in families, which are always emotional and supercharged. In my particular life, and I'm going to get real personal with you today, folks. In my particular life, my father passed away at the beginning of the week. He was 97 years old, and I flew out to New York to his funeral. And while I was there, I gave a eulogy, and I would like to share that eulogy with you today because I think in many ways it ties into the conversations that we're having about family and trusts and communication and how to reverse your thinking about the way you do things. So with your indulgence, here goes. In 1977, singer-songwriter Steve Goodman released a song titled My Old Man, which is a song long beloved as among the greatest ever written from a son about his father. The first time I heard it in the 1980s was when I started to think about what I was going to say this day for my dad. However, I was unsure if I was going to speak today. There has been much said over the decades about my father's shortcomings, mostly by him. But I didn't feel compelled to repeat them, especially not from this pulpit. What do you say about the century of a man's life? Where do you begin? Well, the day before he died, I woke up with what I wanted to share with you today. A person's life, especially a long one, is like the story about the three blind wise men and the elephant. Every side you touch reveals a different persona. To me, Paul Gertz was simply my dad, especially since for me, he became an extraordinary one as I got older. We didn't talk all that much. He wasn't naturally touchy-feely or inclined to discuss feelings. He wasn't overtly internal or psychological in his outlook. He was mostly closed-mouthed about the time he spent in World War II. Wasn't much of a joiner. Loved to argue and debate and discuss business and politics. But he did have a hearty laugh and a twinkle in his eye, and people genuinely liked him. Not surprising that this bright, red-haired third son of Russian Jewish immigrants took up the bagpipes. Not surprising that he hung out with Jimmy Baldwin and his family in his teens, and later on palled around with Thule Kupferberg of the Fugs in the East Village in the 1950s. Not surprising that later in life, he learned to dance with his wife Ann and had what we call moves. He was light on his feet. But I digress. I want to briefly share with you the two things that he did that transformed him in my heart and mind. Firstly, from 1972 until about 1983, he and I did not speak, mostly my choice. Had it been left at that, I suspect that we would have become estranged, as many men do from their fathers. But Paul was not satisfied with that potentiality. He started to write to me, pages of long letters in his inimitable, barely decipherable script, explaining his point of view on many things. It took me weeks to translate them to English, and then, always wanting my youthful last word, I would write, in a fit of pique, a long letter back, equally meandering. Back and forth we went, back and forth. By the time we saw each other again, what enmity we had had was diminished. replaced by unspoken affection. He gets the full credit for maintaining the relationship and mentoring me from afar into my early 30s. He guaranteed me a positive relationship with a father late into my 60s. This is no small thing. I've spoken to many men as I've gotten older who have unfinished business with their fathers. I have none of that. Second, in the 1990s, I was based alone in corporate housing in Cincinnati, working for a mortgage company. I invited him to come out to see me for a long weekend, and he accepted. After we did the sights and museums of Cincinnati and ate at Skyline Chili, we did a single malt Scotch tour of the city. And fairly inebriated and with no distraction from wives or work, we had a really good Donnybrook back at the apartment, aired our lingering grievances and disappointments towards each other and others, compared notes on facts versus fiction, rehashed family stories from different points of view, and came to an imperfect understanding about most of our history together. Enough so that we were no longer burdened by it insofar as we were concerned, replaced mostly by a hearty, open affection and a lightness of being. These are rare things for a man to do for another. I do not mourn him. I celebrate him. He lived long and did it mostly his way, for better or worse. 'Cause no one ever knew a more charming creature on this earth than my old man. See you next week.
Where the living is good.